everybody, and welcome to this tutorial on how to use manual settings. So this video was originally released to my students as part of our distance learning during the COVID-19 outbreak. But I plan on using this video for years to come, so I'm going to show you a little bit about manual settings on a DSLR camera. So we're going to go over some of those settings that we use. Before we get into what the settings are on a DSLR camera, I want to talk about why we use those settings. So when you take a picture with a cell phone or with a point and shoot camera or whatever camera, and if you just have it into the automatic mode, right, what's going to happen is you're going to point at your subject, right, you're going to take that lens cap off, you're going to point at your subject, you're going to press the button, and you're going to take a picture, and then the camera is going to do a lot of the guesswork for you and try and figure out how it's going to make the best possible picture. Now, a lot of times that works great, but sometimes you'll take a picture of someone that's running by and they'll look blurry in the picture, right? Maybe you'll be taking a picture of something still and you want to focus on just one element, maybe in the foreground of your frame, but then everything ends up being in focus. Sometimes your pictures end up a little bit too dark, or they end up too bright in certain areas and they look washed out. And what's great about using a DSLR camera is that you're able to control some settings in order to get what's called the best possible exposure. So you've probably heard that term before. Ask your parents about the cameras that they used when they were kids. If they shot on film, right, you would get a roll of, let's say, 12, 24, or 36 pictures you take, and you would call each one an exposure, right? And the reason why that is because an exposure was one piece of film that was exposed to light so that the image could get printed on that film, right? Now that we're using DSLR cameras or digital cameras, right, there's no longer film in there, but there's a sensor inside this camera. So that sensor is going to be exposed to light, and then with that, you'll have an image that you're then able to copy to your computer, make edits to and print, and do whatever else you might do with it. So we're going to talk about how you can control exposure. And there's something that you'll hear sometimes by a lot of photography instructors. It's called the exposure triangle, right? And so in an exposure triangle, we have three different settings of the camera that we're going to be talking about. So let's jump right in and talk about what those settings are. The first setting is known as shutter speed. What shutter speed is how long your shutter will be open, exposing light to the sensor inside of the camera. So if you have the shutter open for a long period of time, a lot more light is going to be going in because it's just over the duration of time that light is passing through the lens and hitting the sensor. Now, a variety of things are going to happen depending on your light conditions for what your exposure will end up looking like. So our first one is shutter speed. You can make it really, really fast. On this camera, I can make it as fast as 1/8,000th of a second. So that is lightning crazy fast. I can also make it as slow as 30 seconds on one automatic mode, or I could have it open for an infinite amount of time if I'm using a shutter release. So shutter speed is our first thing that we want to think about. The second thing that you can control inside a DSLR is the aperture. So inside of this lens, there is a ring that can open up. It can be called wide open, or it can stop down, limiting the amount of light. So in addition to your shutter speed of how fast that shutter is going to be open and closed, you can control how much light is going to come in at any one time. So if you have a very slow shutter speed that's open for a long period of time and a really wide open aperture, you're going to get a lot of light that's going to come pouring into your camera. So if you're trying to take a picture at night, maybe you're taking a picture of sparklers or things like that. Like, look at this picture, right? This was taken with a wide open aperture and a very slow shutter speed, so that for 5 seconds you can see that image going around. So you can see how much light is able to come in, and then I can control how much light is coming in over that time by how wide that aperture is open. If I want the light to come pouring in, I'm going to have the aperture wide open so that it comes rushing in. But if I just want it to come in slowly, I can control the size of that, right? I want you to think of this as a faucet of water. So if you want to fill a glass that's completely empty, you can have the faucet turned on full blast, and that glass is going to fill up with water really quickly. But you could also have the faucet just barely on and come dripping out. Now it's going to take longer in order to fill that glass, but you'll still get the same amount of water in either way. So the aperture is going to control the volume of light that comes in and hits the sensor at any one time. All right, the third thing we're going to talk about is the ISO, also known as the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor. So you're able to turn that sensor all the way up so that it is incredibly sensitive. So even if you're taking a picture in dark, you'll be able to pull out some of the light. You can also turn that ISO all the way down to, on the cameras that we use at school, 100. Some models of cameras can get even lower or less sensitive. Now, this video that I'm shooting right now, I have the ISO settings to 100 because I'm outside, there's a lot of light coming in, and if it was any more sensitive, I wouldn't be able to have my other settings on the camera the way that I want them to be. Now, the other thing about ISO is it's great to be able to turn that ISO up to take a video or take a picture in the dark. Now, I shot a video at a haunted house once, and I had to have my ISO settings really, really high. But there's a drawback to this. As you take pictures in darker settings and the sensitivity of the sensor has to be increased, what's called digital noise becomes introduced. So if you've ever taken a picture with your cell phone in a pretty dark environment and you zoomed in on it, you notice there were all sorts of grain all over that. And that's because of the sensitivity of that sensor is just way too high in order to do that. But you can control that. A lot of times I'll set my ISO to auto so that it will just choose the correct sensitivity for the other things that I want to control. There's not a lot of style that gets introduced by ISO, unlike with shutter speed or aperture. So we're going to talk about all three of these things in future videos and how they all work. But for now, I just want you to understand the basics of the exposure triangle. We've got shutter speed, we've got aperture, and we have ISO. Now, if you're not at school or you don't have a camera like this, you can still learn how these settings work by using this app. So go ahead and take a look at this link that I've included in the description to the Dslr Simulator, where you're taking a picture of this toy airplane. Now, if you have, when we look at this app, you're going to have some options for putting it in TV mode, in AV mode, or in full manual. For learning the basics of the exposure triangle, I want you to have it set into manual. Now, with it set in manual, you're going to take pictures controlling different elements of each of these settings. So, if you want, for example, your propeller to look like it is blurred, you're going to want a very slow shutter speed. Now, if you slow the shutter speed down too much, you're going to get too much light in your photo and it'll be overexposed. So the goal is to adjust your aperture and ISO settings so that you can still get the motion look that you want controlled by your shutter speed. Some other things that you're going to need to do with it are try and get certain elements in focus, right? So you'll notice in this video, I'm in focus, but the fence and the tree behind me is not. That's because I have my aperture set so that the depth of field is very shallow and it's just on one part. So if you just want the front of the airplane to be in focus, you're going to need to have your aperture wide enough so that the depth of field is small enough. Now, being wide open like that, you're going to get a lot of light into your photo, and you're going to have to increase your shutter speed or adjust your ISO accordingly. So those are the basics of your exposure triangle. Also, if you don't have a DSLR, you can still test this out with some different apps on your cell phone. There are a variety of apps available. Some are paid for apps. I believe there are some free options that'll help simulate some of these functions to give you a little bit more control over your photos. So that's the basics for you. That's the exposure triangle. And I'll see you in the next video where I'm describing a little bit more about each one of those settings.